Hi everyone, we're just giving a few minutes to people, allow people to load into the webinar. We'll start soon. Okay, I think we'll get started and then everyone else can come in while I'm doing a few introductions. First of all, everyone is very welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's my afternoon and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Call to Action for the Future of Volunteering webinar. I'm also introduce myself. I'm Wendy Osborne, Senior Consultant with IAVE, and I'll introduce our presenter in a few moments. I just want to say a few words first about the call to action, and just to say that I'm delighted. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to join with you all today in 2026. Throughout 2025, we really listened to what you were telling us in relation to what you thought was important for the future of volunteering. And the call to action statement was then launched on the 5th of December 2025 at the United Nations in New York. So it's great that we are now in a position to continue to talk about the call to action and actually to focus on some of the really important aspects that are part of it, particularly during this International Volunteer Year. I think that's really important. This is another pivotal moment for volunteering. I was involved 25 years ago in the first International Year, and it's great to see that we now have an opportunity to reinvigorate and to reposition volunteering during 2026 and into the future. I just want to acknowledge the global partners that were with us as part of this call to action journey. There was certainly IAVE giving leadership. There was the Global Volunteering Forum. There was the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. There was UNICEF Generation Unlimited, and there was the Volunteer Groups Alliance. And I know some of them will be on this call today, and I'd just like to recognise and acknowledge their support and help to get us through to the stage that we had on the 5th of December. But really what was also important, and particularly for this webinar, was that we brought our researcher, Dr. Chris Malora, back with us today to talk about the evidence that actually was important in bringing together that call to action statement. That call to action statement was, it was the last stage in really quite a bit of work. And IAVE thought it was important that we revisited that evidence and allowed people at the start of 2026 to hear some more about the insights that you, as a volunteering global community, told us. So the next slide, please, Jessica. So as I said, Chris Malora he's no stranger to IAVE, most certainly, and I'm delighted to share a platform with him again. We've shared many platforms over the last number of years, but he is an academic, a researcher, an author. He has a real interest in youth activism, volunteering, and informal learning. Currently, he is assistant professor in education and social justice at Goldsmiths University of London. And, he really has a real feel for volunteering. And that's why I think he was the perfect person to have with us as we started on the journey with the call to action. And today he's going to outline some of that journey. And he's also, more importantly, going to look at the evidence that you provided for us I mean, this is evidence that the global volunteering community gave us. And I think it's really important that so many of you have been interested and enthused to come forward to join this webinar today. So what I will say that as Chris presents and following his presentation, he will take questions and discussion. We would ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, which you will see on your Zoom screen. Please do that so that we can keep a lookout for what you're saying to us. And also it allows you to put a question in when you hear something that Chris might have said rather than wait to the end of his presentation. So please do that as we go along. And thank you. And I think, Chris, now it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. I hope you can all hear me okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thanks to Ayave, of course, for organizing this event and just really speaking to what Wendy said, right? It's important for us to look at evidence and to look at what people have been telling us in terms of the call to action and way forward. So it's really important, I guess, for us to look into some of the findings from the research, which hopefully I'll be able to spread light, to give light to you today. I think it's important to start this discussion with an emphasis on action, which I think Wendy was able to outline. The call to action really is a campaign piece, no? It's a declaration that places a spotlight on volunteering and its role in societies, urging key decision makers, stakeholders, and all of us who volunteer or work with someone who volunteers. However, it is also important to recognize that this call to action is really coming at a time of what has been described by others as a polycrisis, where there's sort of ever-increasing inequalities, you have strain in public services, we're feeling the impacts of the climate emergency. In many authoritarian states, civil society is narrowing, including volunteering and volunteering opportunities. All of us who work and research in this sector, and I can see a lot of familiar names who are passionate about volunteering here, we all understand that volunteers could offer really significant contributions in addressing or at least abating some of these challenges, may that be within or outside our organizations, or, for example, as individuals who are organizing in their own communities. Yet we also know that volunteers are often impacted by the very challenges as well. In the context of conflicts and wars, for example, volunteers are targeted and work in very unsafe conditions. In shrinking civil societies, volunteering may not be supported or recognized, and in extreme cases, even politicized. So this is the backdrop within which this global call to action is needed and is more urgent than ever. So I thought I'd like to give that context a little bit of our conversation. And because of this sort of global nature and some of these global challenges, it was then important that in developing the call to action, it was important for us to hear from as many people as possible and cast the net widely to achieve a truly global consultation. So let me briefly walk you through the journey that brought us here. The call to action, like what Wendy said earlier, it was co-created by, if you like, leaders in the sector on volunteering. You have the Global Volunteering Forum, the International Association of Volunteer Effort, the Red Cross, IFRC, UNICEF Generation Unlimited, Volunteer Groups Alliance, working closely with UN volunteers. It began with a challenge paper, which was outlining key trends in volunteering. So the paper, which is what we've called the challenge paper, and I'm sure our colleagues from Ayave will be able to share a copy of that. It is available, open access for you to have a look. It mapped the landscape of volunteering, current challenges, right? Like the growing use of digital technology in volunteering, the inequalities that continue to shape who gets to volunteer, the changing profile of volunteers. But also the paper also asked strategic questions about what does the shared global vision of volunteering could look like, and how can different stakeholders like you and me can help create the right enabling environment for volunteering to thrive. So the paper then formed the basis for 4 international online dialogues. Participants used these sessions to test their ideas. This was very early in the process. it was a test ideas that was being raised by the challenge paper, surfaced some of the early priorities, for example, financing volunteering programs, ensuring volunteer safety and security, to strengthening policy and support. Next slide, please. Now, these early insights then formed the basis of a global survey that reached over 10,000 respondents from across 164 countries. At the same time, organizations and communities in 74 countries hosted what we called global dialogues, giving voice to over 4,000 individuals to explore these issues in greater depth, rooted in their local and national contexts. In total, if you combine both data sets, it brought together close to 14,000 individuals from 164 countries. So if you like, the survey was sort of giving us this sort of overview, numerical overview, if you like, because it was quantitative data, right? Overview of some of the challenges and some of the priorities of those who have accessed the survey and have filled in the survey. And then the dialogues, they were able to bring the issues that was highlighted through the challenge paper and to the initial dialogues right into their local communities. So we really wanted to understand, okay, what does financing volunteering look like in, a local community, for instance, in a particular country? So we want people to talk through these issues in more depth. And we gathered reports from all of those dialogues and brought them together in an insights paper. Some of the insights I present to you today. And again, the insights paper is available, open access for you to have a look on the AYAVE website. Now, so the challenge then became, how do you bring together all of these insights from the 10,000 respondents, from the 4,000 individuals in the dialogue, bringing them together in this paper that some of which I'm going to share with you today. And then there was also a sense-making group. And I think some of the people in that group are actually in the call today. So thank you very much for your contribution. It was a sense-making group drawn from civil society, government, academia, volunteer-involving organizations, youth volunteers. In September 2025, this group met online and in London to reflect on the insights from the paper. And also that became the start of developing the call to action for the future of volunteering, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So drawing from the insights paper, the group identified some of the most urgent themes that have come up from the data and developed a series of call to action statements that we've drafted. And then this were then again reviewed, strengthened, and ultimately shaped the call to action that we have today. Next slide, please. So today, I'm going to focus on what we found on the insights paper. So there were 13 insights in the paper. I know that's quite a lot. And they are grouped into 3 key themes: the value of volunteering, enabling environment for volunteers, power in volunteering, and protection of volunteers. I won't be able to go through everything, of course, this afternoon, but what I thought I'd do is to go through each of the themes and each of these 3 groupings and highlight some of the significant issues under each banner. Again, I encourage you to have a look at the paper when you have the time and see which of some of these findings are, relevant to your own work or relevant to your own context. Okay, so the first theme, next slide please, is around valuing volunteering. The research has reinforced just how valuable volunteers are within systems of local, national, and global development. Next slide, please. The data that we gathered, both from the large-scale survey and the global dialogue, shows very clearly that volunteering, so all of those who have responded to the survey, volunteers and volunteer-involving organizations, they clearly show that volunteering, whether formal or informal volunteering, plays a crucial role in advancing the Sustainable Development Goals. So what you can see here on the screen are the Sustainable Development Goals that they feel their volunteering makes most impact. But all of the Sustainable Development Goals are listed. So all of the volunteers feel that they're contributing to almost all of the SDGs. And these are the top ones that you can see on your screen. Next slide, please. Yet despite these contributions, our findings currently highlight still, that there's still a major gap, that these benefits and these contributions of volunteering often remain under-recognized, and the impact of volunteering remains poorly measured and insufficiently integrated into policy processes. We have identified several misconceptions where volunteering is seen as a plug-in or ancillary to development programs as opposed to an essential element to development, or volunteering, some people have recognized, as being seen as cheap or free labor as opposed to a practice that's worthy of investment, or volunteering is seen as something that's just nice to have as opposed to an integrated strategy for local development. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In this quote, we can see we must tailor volunteer roles to today's youth, not the other way around. Most youth are drawn from causes and not chores. They want to make a difference. And that is an actual comment from one of the global dialogues that was organized. So this highlights, right, that valuing volunteering also means valuing different forms and modalities of volunteering, including informal, person-to-person helping activities that are rooted really on solidarity. It is a challenge, right, for many organizations that we need to adapt our volunteering activities to the causes that the young people, for example, are very much attuned to or are very much important to young people. Several dialogues have pointed out, for instance, that the pandemic or the recent pandemic, the climate crisis, economic pressures, these are all shaping the way how and when people volunteer and how do they want to get involved. There were dialogues that have identified, for instance, declining volunteer participation. Others noted that, well, many volunteers now volunteer based on causes, such as what you can see here on the screen, and not in organizations. So this is why maybe they're seeing a decline in volunteer participation in organizations, but still there's still a lot of volunteering happening informally or outside volunteer organizations. You have emerging technologies have also been identified through the dialogues, including AI-powered volunteering matching platforms, digital volunteering opportunities. They were all seen as vital tools to expand participation in volunteering. Opportunities need to be flexible, right? They need to be modular, they need to be inclusive, with a recognition, right, that many young people and many volunteers face constraints from education and work. A significant aspect as well of the findings was the emphasis on the relationship between volunteering and social cohesion. And previous slide, please. And I just wanted to show that picture that was sent to us by some of our colleagues in Ghana, right? Because I think this encapsulates one of the findings there of the importance of volunteering in strengthening communities by fostering social cohesion or building solidarity through everyday care and collective action. This supports the idea that volunteering does not only facilitate service delivery, not only social cohesion, but also strengthening democracy and building civil communities from below and enhancing citizen participation. There is, of course, broader research that sort of looks at the links between volunteering and solidarity, and some of these we also highlight in the paper. However, there are some questions here around over-reliance to some of these helping activities that needs particular attention, especially from development workers, institutions, and governments. Over-reliance to some of these person-to-person helping activities and helping behaviors without considering the real vulnerabilities that these groups face may sometimes lead to exploitation of the energies of the poorest in a given society. So while it became important to recognize that, well, everybody, even in most marginalized communities, continue to volunteer towards social cohesion, we also need to recognize that sometimes these are the very people who are experiencing the vulnerabilities or the challenges that they're trying to address. And so we need to recognize those, right? Otherwise, it could lead to exploitation of the energies of even the poorest of any given society. So this is why the next two areas, sort of recognizing how people can volunteer, can be supported to volunteer, is significant because they focus on support and safeguarding of volunteers, which I will turn to next. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the the research also sheds light that on what enables people to volunteer, or what enables people what enables volunteering to thrive. Next slide, please. There is a dialogue in the Philippines that highlights this. While the Filipino people's traditional spirit of solidarity remains strong, today's volunteering calls for more than just willing hearts. It requires structured support, professional management, and sustainable resources. So for me, this is a very good quote that I think highlights the importance of supporting volunteers in ways that go beyond just relying on people's helping activities or desire to help another. Across survey responses and dialogue contributions, participants pointed to the need for coherent volunteering infrastructure, that is, having clear policies, adequate support systems, sustained collaboration across sectors. However, our analysis also shows that these elements are frequently fragmented or sometimes missing altogether. Next slide, please. The findings emphasize that inclusion and equity are central to volunteering, to being able to volunteer, yet there remains a challenge in ensuring that this is achieved. Many participants, particularly those from marginalized groups, describe several barriers that prevent them from accessing or leading volunteering opportunities. We heard, for example, that the most common challenge really that people face is socioeconomic. Around 65% said they struggle with things like transport costs, meals, or trying to balance work and volunteering. Close behind, there are people who say, well, 61% of those have also identified that, they don't know what opportunities are out there, for them to be able to volunteer. Well, there are those who identify that there just isn't enough opportunities in their area. Geography plays a big role too. Sometimes, volunteering happens in places that are too far away from them. In one of our dialogues, there was an emphasis that volunteering initiatives and opportunities often happen in cities with far fewer available in rural and underserved communities. There are, of course, also challenges around lack of access for certain groups, including people with disabilities, LGBTQI communities, and there is this concern as well around safety and risks that comes with volunteering, which were enough to discourage them from volunteering. There was also a talk about the administrative burden of getting involved in volunteering. So some felt that there was too much bureaucracy to be accepted as a volunteer, or that requirements to take part were simply too demanding. So these are some of the barriers that was identified in the research. Next slide, please. Now, there's also this, even though there's this broad agreement that volunteering brings real social value, that belief does not always translate into actions, right? And into the resources that it receives. This might be because volunteering is often seen as, cheap labor or free labor, but we are consistently hearing, right, that volunteering or volunteers need resources. So like in Ghana, for instance, they say many volunteer projects and initiatives run on passion but not on funds, and that needs to be addressed. Or from Palestine, without sufficient resources, many organizations struggle to provide meaningful engagement and training to support volunteers. So resourcing is very important. More than half of the respondents rated investment in national and community initiatives as insufficient or very insufficient, and only in tiny proportion, around 4 to 6%, felt that financial support is truly excellent. Okay, now whom do the respondents see as stakeholders most responsible for a greater investment and support of creating these enabling environments? Over 80% of those surveyed said that it should be local and national governments, highlighting the dominant sentiment that public authorities should primarily drive funding towards volunteering programs with complementary support from the private sector, philanthropy groups, and foundations. This evidence from this project underscores that when these barriers are addressed, volunteering becomes not only more widespread, but also more impactful. So enabling environment is important. Next slide. The third and the final issue I'd like to talk to you about is around power in volunteering and protection of volunteers. Next slide, please. The research draws attention to the power dynamics that shape who gets to volunteer and under which conditions. Participants highlighted how unequal power relations can influence program design, decision-making, and the distribution of opportunities. This was especially evident in conversations around international volunteering or volunteering across different countries, which I know many of us here are involved with, where there was a call to shift towards models that are grounded in local leadership, local practices, and reciprocal learning. As one global dialogue summarizes it, international volunteering must evolve. Equal access and mutual respect are non-negotiable. This involves shifting from a charity mindset to one that is rooted in solidarity, reciprocity, and local ownership. Related to this, and I think this is one thing that AYAVE has also looked at, and the Global Volunteering Forum has also looked at as well, and some of my work has looked at some of the global imbalance in research and evidence in volunteering. There is a wider concern around how knowledge about volunteering and development is produced and circulated. Next slide, please. In a collaborative work with colleagues from South Africa and Mexico, this is beyond the call to action, the insights paper, we found that there were persistent inequalities in volunteering research. As you can see here, right, from one of the Africa dialogue, that there is the importance or strong support for South to South and South to North exchanges, particularly in volunteering knowledge production, allowing African expertise, for example, in volunteering, to be shared globally and not just receiving. So the geopolitics of knowledge production in volunteering, the kind of evidence that are being gathered about what volunteering looks like and who gets to volunteer is important. So these questions around, what types of volunteering are recognized, which research is valued, which perspectives or kind of evidence influences policy and practice. According to our research for this call to action, these are important to understand because they can influence the kinds of decisions and the kinds of commitments that people would give to declarations such as the International Year of Volunteering. Next slide, please. At the same time, the study has surfaced urgent concerns around safety and safeguarding and protection of volunteers, particularly those who are working in humanitarian settings and conflict-affected areas. Our findings make it clear that addressing these power imbalances and strengthening protections is essential for ethical, meaningful, and sustainable volunteering. In a dialogue in Palestine, the sentiment was clear. Many of our fellow volunteers have been targeted. We urgently need international protection and concrete enforcement of our rights under international law. Now, these sentiments carry a sense of urgency, right? While there's a strong critique that that volunteers are not recognized or celebrated in the context of conflict and wars, volunteers are targeted, and volunteers sort of seem to need to argue for their humanness, not least their role in peace building. Sawaid 19, for example, sits as one of the sense-making group members. If you can just go to the next slide, please. So this organization in Palestine sits as one of our members of our sense-making group. And on their website, they paid tribute to 4 volunteers who were killed during the current war in Gaza. And the tribute came with a poem that says, you can see here, they were volunteers, not militants, healers, not fighters, carriers of light, not bearers of destruction, and yet they were targeted and silenced. It's very clear from organizations like UN Volunteers that humanitarians and volunteers are not targeted. So what does it mean for a call to action to fight for recognition and support, but not for protection? So that's why I think this call to action sort of recognizes that these 3 should come together. how can we be in solidarity with fellow volunteers whose work are being demonized, are being policed, and being stopped at all costs? In the survey, 68% of the respondents identify safety, security, and well-being of the volunteers as the most important and urgent area of investment. Similarly, over 51% stress the need for policies and provisions that ensure safety and protection of volunteers as a key element in enabling environment for volunteers and for volunteering. Next slide, please. So now, because of this insights paper, we have the call to action for the future of volunteering. The call to action is clear. Volunteers, this 14,000 voices, call on stakeholders to recognize, support, and protect volunteering so that all people are well enabled to volunteer with greater impact. We all know this, and again, you can definitely have a look at the call to action that would be available for you now across different languages, I believe. If you can go to the next slide, please. The call to action has 3 areas: recognition, support, and safeguarding. Recognition, volunteers need to be systematically recognized, valued, and celebrated. And that means moving beyond symbolic appreciation. There is a call for a need for real systemic recognition through policies, through funding, and by embedding volunteering into strategies that help shape our communities. The second call to action is around support. Volunteering isn't always cost-free. It doesn't always just happen on its own. While a lot of volunteering happens spontaneously, it needs support. It thrives when there's an enabling environment, one that supports participation, maximizes impact, and evolves alongside our changing social and ecological realities. Now more than ever, we must create safe environments, and that's the third call to action around safeguarding, where volunteering can truly flourish. The safety, rights, well-being, and dignity of volunteers and of the people that they work with must be paramount. So it was very clear in the call to action that safeguarding is not only about protecting volunteers, but also protecting the people that volunteers are working with. And that's why there needs to be safeguarding systems in place, especially when working with vulnerable communities or vulnerable beneficiaries of development programs. So only then, when we support volunteers and safeguard volunteers, can really volunteering contribute confidently, or volunteers can contribute confidently without fear or harm, fear of harm and exploitation. Now, I think one thing that, just to close, I guess, when we were sort of developing, when we were finding out the answers to these questions, of course, there are some new things here, probably that are new to some of you, but I think a lot of these issues we've already known in the past, no? So I think, I hear that a lot when I present some of this work, or even in the dialogues that we've been conducting, that some of these issues have already been existing for a long time. And I think that just sort of reinforces this idea that if these challenges have been occurring and remain, despite all of the progress, I guess, that has been done in terms of volunteer management and volunteering program design, I think more work needs to be done in terms of making sure that volunteering is supported for it to be able to thrive. And I think what has been really useful and what has been really inspiring about the work that has come into this insights paper, into the global call to action, is this sense of solidarity across different stakeholder groups, volunteers themselves, coming together and say, yes, we support the call to action. Yes, we endorse it. And yes, there's something needs to be done so that volunteers can be recognized, supported, and safeguarded and recognized in their work. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions or basically hear any feedback from our colleagues here. Wendy, do you want to? Thank you.
Yes, so please put your questions in the Q&A. I don't see too many at the moment, but please do so, because the insights are really important here. I mean, to me, the insights paper and indeed the call to action actually, are the context for this United Nations International Year, because they're saying that, my experience of 2001 was that, some of these issues were pertinent then too. So what we're saying is that if we are now to look forward to the future of volunteering, which is successful, and then we do need to make some changes, all of us. And I think the insights paper indicate what some of those key changes should be. So please do put questions in. I can't think that there wouldn't be questions from this global audience, most definitely not. We do have two questions now. One is the insights and challenge paper are very, very valuable, but the information is very high level. Is there any way we can access deeper, more specific or local findings? And then another question is about elaborating on the youth angle. So Chris, if you could take those.
Yes, I think, yes. So, I mean, Alice, thank you for that question. I think with the data set as big as what we had, it was really challenging to slice it down up to local sort of level or country level. But yes, there is a possibility to perhaps slice and analyze data according, for instance, to whether, to what people from particular countries are saying or particular regions are saying. So there is a possibility of doing that. But again, it wasn't part of the original insights paper. But yes, we do invite people. I know there were people who have asked to look at to look at the data and see whether they can reanalyze it, which I think is something that we've been discussing, or Wendy has been discussing, for instance, with the scoping group, to see how the data can be used further. But yes, I think we invite people not to look at the insights paper and maybe reflect on what is the relevance of it in your own particular context based on what you found in the data. And we've already had, for example, interest from people or from organizations saying, well, one thing that we want to do, for example, is we want to speak to the gender lens or to the gendered aspect of some of these issues. So now they're taking the findings from the research and the call to action to see and understand, right, what are some of the gender implications of this, and they're sort of developing a think piece along those lines. So please do engage with some of these issues and send us any possible further research that might be interesting in this area. Well, the youth angle, yes, I think it's a lot of the stuff around young people was really came out with this really linked to issues around solidarity, I guess, and the issues around changing modes by which young people are volunteering. So there was again, as I said in my presentation, there were organizations that are worried that young people are not volunteering, and then you have a bit of a youth voice saying, well, it's not that we're not volunteering, but actually we're not volunteering in your organization because the way we volunteer now looks very differently than how we volunteered in the past, right? So more short-term volunteering, for instance, more cost-based volunteering rather than organization-based volunteering. And I think there's this very strong emphasis on young people and activism and the role of volunteering in activism and activist work, and vice versa, right? That volunteering is not only about maintaining the status quo, but for many young people, they volunteer because they want change. And some of these change are fundamental change and radical change that they want to see in their societies. So volunteers, for example, are the engines, being seen as the engines and leaders of many campaigns and activist work in many communities. So I think a better recognition of these different ways by which young people volunteer, and recognizing that, and for organizations to meet young people, where they are, I think it's also very important. Hopefully that answers a bit of the questions.
Chris, we have some questions in the Q&A, but we've had a couple that popped up in the chat, so I'll allow you to look at the Q&A ones while I'm having, and I'll recap on the ones from the chat. Well, one question is about some information from research, actually from students actually at Queen's University Belfast, who are saying that they're not deterred by volunteering itself, but by organisational structures that cannot provide clarity, flexibility, or meaningful progression. And this probably goes to that finding of yours about bureaucracy. And then the other one is about the future of volunteering, and do we think that moving forward towards less aid focused, more technological form of volunteering, and how so can we build continue having a significant impact if that is the case? And is it better to focus more on employment or education, developing skills within communities? I think this goes to the heart of sort of volunteering evolving. And, so if you could take both of those, and then we'll go back to the Q&A.
Okay, well, also, I don't have the answers to all of these questions. Maybe just this. These are very, very difficult practice-based questions, right? But yes, they are the types of questions that I think we need to be asking, and hopefully the data has inspired us to think through some of these questions and maybe how we can apply it into our own organization. So this sort of issue around organizational structures, right? I mean, it's something that what I found in my own research is something that have existed a long time ago. I've read in 1990. I researched in the 1990s that talk about how volunteers were bombarded with training before they even have to volunteer. And then they were saying, one of the quotes there said, well, why am I expected to spend so much time training for an activity that I'm doing for free? So it just makes it very inaccessible for certain groups, the bureaucracy that's part of volunteering. And I see that as well with my research in the Philippines, right? Where you have small organizations, community-based organizations that where volunteers are being subjected to really bureaucratic processes before they can even volunteer. So I guess I give back that question to you. How can we? I think that's a really good question. How can we? First of all, how can organizations shift their organization practices so that it becomes more accessible? But also, what kind of support organizations can have, right? So that, considering the resources that are limited, is what Denise is saying, or that manpower or human resource is also limited, how can we sort of adapt and make our activities and our processes more flexible? The role of technology, I mean, there's a lot of initiatives that looks at how technology can aid access to volunteering. I mean, all of these issues, right, that you've identified, Victoria, I think these are all really important. And I guess it depends on what the focus is of a particular organization. So, for example, I know that maybe you can speak to this, Wendy, because I know that Ayave, for instance, is this very strong research and initiative around volunteering and employability, right? That volunteering is a starting point or a stepping stone towards youth employability, which I think is also something that I'm seeing quite a lot in terms of thinking about the future of volunteering, that there needs, especially for young people, that there needs to be a closer link between volunteering as, as an act of solidarity, as an act of philanthropy, etc., but also how does it develop the volunteer, him or herself, so that they become a bit more employable, or that they gain skills towards employability. So I've been hearing, for instance, from colleagues looking at things like micro-credentials, or being able to certify certain skills and recognize certain skills that come up of volunteering. So these are some of the innovations, I think, that we're seeing in the sector that are quite refreshing, if you like.
Because just to come in on those 2 points, actually, and just to say that one of the things that I think is really important here, it's really quite simple, is that organizations have a tendency to focus on their own expectations, and a little more focus on the expectations of the volunteers would probably actually help to manage the situation where, what if someone's coming to you to volunteer, well, what do you think their expectations are? And do you value those expectations? And, can you help to meet them? So those are some of the kind of practice issues that organizations, I think, really need to focus on as we future cast for volunteering into 2030 and beyond.
Yeah.
There was a question that has come in about corporate volunteering and what the insights were saying about corporate volunteering. Now, we did have a response from corporates and from actually people who are corporate volunteers. Is there anything you'd like to say about that, Chris?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think there was an emphasis around, particularly for corporates and in these groups, there was an emphasis around resourcing to support governments and civil society organizations to help finance and resource volunteering. I think there was also an emphasis around collaboration and the importance of these different stakeholders sort of working together, really. And that was emphasized again in light of these questions around volunteering and employability, and how there was one dialogue that that talked about how training, I think it was somewhere in the African region, where they're talking about how important it was for them to think of volunteering as something that is a concern not only of civil society organization, not only of governments, but also of corporations, because these different sectors working together and speaking to each other would help facilitate more employable skills for volunteers. And I think there was a really strong emphasis on that, particularly with young people. So I mean, there's lots more, I guess, around corporates and business sector in the Insights paper, and I encourage you to have a look at that. Wendy, there was just one comment here from Alan around bureaucracy, and sometimes it's about explaining why bureaucracy is needed, good and bad bureaucracy. I agree, definitely. I mean, I'm not saying that, I guess people are not saying that these checks and balance should not exist, because in some contexts, they are really, really important, especially, for instance, with working with vulnerable groups or in health settings, for example. These are really, really important. But I think what's also missing is this issue of mediation, right? That sometimes, at least in my experience in the Philippines, oftentimes it is the volunteers that are being left alone to almost deal with this bureaucracy without someone mediating some of this bureaucratic process for them. And I think that learning aspect, or that moderating, or that sort of mediating aspect is missing. But yes, some of these bureaucracies, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, are necessary for volunteering practice, especially around safeguarding and security and safety of volunteers as well, and the people they work with. I think there's lots of comments on the chat box. I think lots of reflections, Wendy. So it would be good
yes,
if people
if people can look at those, because we're, there is a experience in this room of volunteering, which is really important, and sharing that with each other is really helpful. There is. Are there other questions in the Q&A you want to take, Chris?
So I can't see all of them. There's a question here in the chat around people feeling unsafe around volunteering. And was this, sorry, but I think this is in the chat box, Wendy. If there's anything in the Q&A, Wendy, that you think might be good to address, just let me know. But there's one here around feeling unsafe around volunteering. No, I think this was about people sometimes feeling that it is not safe for them to volunteer. So yes, many of these come from humanitarian contexts or humanitarian settings, conflict settings, but also there were some places where volunteering is being politicized, right? So that volunteering, for instance, is policed. We've had that evidence as well of, people saying that, even volunteers are, not allowed to go to certain places, or that volunteers are being seen as, people against the government, politicizing volunteering activity. So those also happen. Those concerns are also existing. And really, people are trying to think about how do we make it as safe as possible for people to volunteer. But also there was the emphasis of making sure that the beneficiaries, quote unquote, I don't like that word very much, but the people who receive volunteering or volunteer action are also safe from volunteers, because it could be an opportunity, I mean, there was an emphasis in some of the dialogues of, lots of issues around harassment, for example, or unsafe working conditions or unsafe practices of volunteers themselves. volunteers being placed in situations where they don't know how to react or they don't know how to deal with local needs. And that makes it unsafe for the beneficiaries or from the local community within which the volunteers are working with. So it's both sides. And we launched the IVY in Ireland. I was there in Dublin, and this was an emphasis in that region, that there needs to be a focus as well of making sure that the people who are receiving the volunteers are also safe. So it's both the volunteers themselves and the people that they're working with, and I think that's being emphasized in the call to action.
Chris, someone was asking just about data collection, and if you could just briefly go over again, how and when the data was collected.
So, well, the data collection. So there's about 10,000 respondents for the global survey, and then the dialogues. There were 4,000, close to 4,000 people who have attended dialogues. Now, the dialogues is interesting because they were conducted by organizations in their own communities. Most of them actually are at country level, sort of community level, if you like. There were regional ones as well, but most of them are at country, sort of local level. And I think that's interesting because we were able to get in-depth insights, because some of these for example, some of the dialogues, for instance, would focus on a particular aspect of the call to action, like employability, or one would focus on safety and security. So it's good to get the balance of sort of this big overview through the survey, but also the dialogue or the in-depth dialogue that happened in communities. One thing that perhaps we could share, Wendy, right, is that we've developed a dialogue toolkit? Something along those lines, Wendy, was that what we called it? Sorry,
yes.
Yeah. So it was like a toolkit that is, I think, available open access from Mayave and from Forum and from the scoping group, where basically it's like a toolkit or a guidance if you want to do a dialogue yourself in your own community and in your own context. There were a series of questions there. There were slides that are available. And I don't know at this point, you could even, it might be worth, doing a dialogue like this in your own community, in your own local organization, just to see what are some of the implications and some of these findings to your own work. And for me, that's the most, of course, the survey was fantastic. It was able to give us this kind of fantastic overview, but really some of the more detailed and more sophisticated, if you like, explanation of some of these issues really came out from the dialogue. There were lots of insights there that I think we were able to bring in, as you can see from the quotes that that I've shared with you this afternoon.
And I think that's really important to emphasize that this is all about collective action, and it still remains about collective action, and that those people who, those organizations and individual volunteer leaders who organize the global dialogues and use the facilitator notes were really, giving a leadership to helping us gather information, which was so important. And someone else in the chat has talked about, and I think this is really helpful, it's really difficult to bring quite disparate information together and to create a global call to action, because you must be able to see in those commitments something that is relevant to you in your situation. And actually, someone has just said in the chat that they were delighted to see that actually the things that were being raised at a global level through the call to action are things that are pertinent to them in their own local situation. And I think that that's really a success of the call to action, if it resonates with you where you are in terms of your volunteering. And that's really important. And
and also, sorry, Wendy, also just to say, I'm just looking through some of the chats here from the Q&A here, and I think there is this I think people want to do something, I guess. So there's a lot of the questions around what can we do, what changes needs to happen, and what are the concrete actions that we can take. And I think that is a question beyond, I guess, the call to action. So almost like the call to action is, if you think of it, and I don't know if you agree with me with this, Wendy and colleagues, it's sort of like a starting point, or almost like a framework for action. And then I think the invitation is for you to have a look at your own context and see which parts of this call to action which call to action statements might you be able to operationalize in your own work? And I also approach it like this, because I'm a researcher, right? I sit in academia. I sit at a university here in London. I do a lot of work with young people. And when I was sort of helping develop the call to action, that was the thing that was on my mind. How can I take some of these findings and maybe develop a research project that addresses one of these? That might be the action that has the concrete action that might have come out of this global call to action. I mean, it's not really, I think we've agreed that the call to action is not the final word on the topic, or not the final word on the issue. It is a starting point, and we want people to continue talking about it and really exploring how they might be able to apply this in their own work. And I hopefully, after the 2026 year, we'll have examples from all around the world to see how they were able to apply or reflect on the call to action. Maybe it's limited. Maybe there's an action statement that is missing, and that is a continued conversation, I think, that we need to have. What do you think, Wendy?
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we've always said that the call to action, it's a pivotal moment, particularly this is the International Year, but certainly AVI sees it as something that goes beyond that and takes us forward into the future for volunteering, and that the commitment is that the call to action needs to be worked on over a few years. It just isn't easy to make. It was a change agenda, and and what we want to see is a change being made. Someone has asked about how we will know what success looks like, Chris.
Yeah. I saw that as well. I don't know how to answer it.
And thank you, Alan. And I think one of the things is, of course, if we were doing this survey again in, say, 5 years' time, and the answers were very much more positive about recognition, and people felt that volunteers were more valued, and that volunteers felt more safe, and that there was a greater enabling environment, then I think we would see that is success. But I think what we will rely on in the meantime is our networks, and our very strong global networks telling us that things have changed. But change doesn't just happen. It takes that momentum and that movement. So all of us in this call and all of us involved in volunteering are part of that change, and we need to make it, and we need to advocate for those who have the power to also make change to do that. And that's what's really important here. And this is the start of a journey, and I'm delighted, because from the now that the questions we've generated now the discussion and the questions and the Q&A and the chats coming up. Clearly, we could have even had more time to keep discussing that, and that's the really important thing. We want to keep this as a live issue. That is what's really important. We want to keep it live and at the forefront of our minds, and on the minds of those who can influence volunteering. I think that's really important. Chris, is there anything else? Because I'm conscious we're running out of time.
No, that's all for me. That's all for me, Wendy.
Oh, great. I'd like to thank everyone for joining with us today, and for bringing such insight forward and such interest. And and if we could go back to the last slide there. Yes. So at the end of the call to action, what we said was what you can do now. And this is really important, to share the call to action. If you haven't already shared with your networks, leave this webinar and please do so. I'm delighted to say it was launched in English on the 5th of December, but it is now available in Arabic, Chinese, Portuguese, Russian, French, and Spanish. And, all of that can be accessed from the AVI website, and will probably also be available on our partner organizations' websites. So please do take those translations and use them. That's really important. And then say yes. Join us. Add your voice to all our voices and say yes, and be proactive with that. IAVI is working to see if we can develop something which will allow us to have a dedicated, call to action resource where people can tell us what they're doing and can share that. We can share that with each other. So we may have some exciting news on that in the next couple of months, but I can only put a teaser out at this moment. I can't put anything else out at the moment. And also use this year you will probably all be involved in doing something for IVY. Match that with the call to action. When you talk about the International Year, also talk about the call to action in the same sentence. And that is really important. We need to keep this profile high, and we need to really make the change agenda something which is a reality, not just an aspiration. So thank you. Now, the next slide is, of course, to remind everyone that 2026 is a year for the AVI World Volunteer Conference. It will be held in Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It runs from November the 16th to the 18th. Please, the dates have slightly changed. There's a week out from what we may have originally said they were. So please note the new date, November the 16th to 18th. The theme is about volunteering and social impact. And we'll also be taking forward the call to action and the commitments and weaving those in across the conference themes. So we're really looking forward to seeing as many people as possible join us for the World Volunteer Conference. I will say that there will be a call for presenters, and that will be going out hopefully within the next number of weeks. So if you are a practitioner, or if you are a researcher, and there is something in the call for presenters that is of interest to you, then please do make an application, because we are looking to have a diversity of speakers. And more importantly, we're looking to see what is the emerging and innovative practice that is coming forward for volunteering to help us drive it into the the next decade. So just finally to say a big thank you to Chris for joining us today and taking us through the Insights paper, and also to say thank you to everyone who's joined us. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to your continued engagement in the call to action. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye. Thank you.